penalty shootout the most chaotic way to resolve the highest stakes game in some of those players' lives?
I would argue in the world.
Yeah. But I love chaos. I enjoy it. I think that it's great.
If I didn't love chaos, I wouldn't be in the podcasting politics biz.
That's right.
It's time for Sound Politics. This is Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. And we're also joined by KUOW state government reporter Sarah Mises-Tan. Hey, Sarah. Nice to have you back on the show.
It's good to be here.
So, Sarah, you have been putting in work getting ready for election season and looking really closely at one specific initiative that Washingtonians will vote on from Let's Go Washington.
Let's Go Washington, the conservative PAC that is led by hedge fund manager Brian Haywood.
Yes, and one of his new initiatives would ban transgender girls from competing in girls' K through 12 sports. And this issue is obviously top of mind because of a recent Supreme Court decision.
Right. So the court ruled on two cases, one that originated in West Virginia, one in Idaho. And the justices upheld those states' laws that prohibit transgender girls from competing in girls' sports. And we're going to talk about why the court ruled that way and how this could affect our state and kind of the politics swirling around this issue today. But Sarah, really quick first, does this ruling from the court, the Supreme Court, affect the Haywood initiative at all?
Yeah, so it doesn't have a direct impact on the initiative, but it does create pressure in Washington. It throws fuel on a culture war fire that's been burning here already. The feds are investigating Washington's trans-inclusive sports policies right now. And as we head into election season, voters will see this trans athlete initiative on their ballot in November. But before we get there, I want to highlight some key differences between the laws the Supreme Court looked at and the ones that voters will consider here. And we might see a different Supreme Court, the one in this Washington, rule on this issue too.
Yeah. Even though the SCOTUS decision this week doesn't directly impact our state initiative, right, I do think it brings up a contrast that is key and raises a really big question on this issue that our voters will have to decide. That the fact that it's not just about should trans girls play in sports, right? It's if we decide that trans girls shouldn't, how do you make girls prove they're not trans?
Yeah, how do you enforce that?
Right, exactly. Because as you're going to talk about, Sarah, that is a really key question that differs between this state and this initiative and the other states that just went to the Supreme Court. And we're going to talk about all of it today on Sound Politics after the break.
From KUOW in Seattle, this is Sound Politics. I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone, and we're here with Sarah Mises-Tan.
And Sarah, we are talking today about whether a Supreme Court decision on trans athletes actually affects Washington. And I do just want to set some levels really quick. There are somewhere between 5 and 10 trans student athletes competing in Washington right now. That's according to the State Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. You know, trans kids here are allowed to play on sports teams that align with their gender identity. They have been able to do that for decades. So a trans boy can play on boys' teams or trans girls can play on girls' teams. It's just a very tiny number of kids who actually fall into that category. And I think it's probably important to say that out front.
Yeah, or at least that we have record of. But obviously this conversation has taken an outsized role in politics, particularly in conservative circles. President Trump spent a lot of money in 2024 painting Democrats as too extreme on trans issues. Sports was probably the centerpiece of that. And I think that Democrats never did find a great way to respond, certainly in 2024, maybe since, because when it comes to high school sports, this is a very divisive issue. Sarah, I don't think it is surprising that the U.S. Supreme Court upheld state laws banning trans girls from competing in girls' and women's sports, though I think their rationale probably paints a picture of where conservatives stand on this issue. But just tell us, why did the Supreme Court uphold these laws in Idaho and West Virginia?
So Idaho enacted a law in 2020 that banned transgender girls from competing in any girls' school sports from elementary to college age. And since then, there have been 26 other states that followed suit and passed similar laws. A legal challenge to Idaho's law was roped in with a challenge to a similar West Virginia law. And those are the two cases that the court ruled on yesterday. The majority of justices ultimately agreed that these state laws didn't violate Title IX, the federal law that prevents sex-based discrimination. Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote the majority opinion, and he focused on fairness and the risk of injury because of, quote unquote, inherent physical differences that are relevant to athletic performance. Basically, he's saying that most trans girls are bigger, faster, and stronger than cisgender girls or girls who were assigned female at birth. Justice Sotomayor wrote a dissenting opinion and endorsed sending the case back to a lower court because she believes there isn't enough data to definitively state if there are, in fact, inherent physical differences when a transgender girl doesn't, say, go through male puberty, as was the case with the transgender student in the West Virginia case.
So basically, the majority in this opinion is saying that trans kids' rights to access school sports are not protected under Title IX or the 14th Amendment. Title IX, is supposed to provide equal athletic opportunity for members of both sexes, but the justices say that doesn't include trans kids. So that's where the Supreme Court sits on this issue right now. And we know this is something that the executive branch is interested in. The U.S. Department of Education is investigating Washington and individual school districts in our state over policies that allow trans girls to play in girls' sports. The department is saying that, those policies could violate Title IX. Sarah, can you catch us up on what Washington policy is on trans athletes, especially in K through 12 sports?
Yeah, so Washington has really led the way in terms of transgender inclusion in sports in the nation. It was one of the first states in the country to explicitly say in 2007 that student athletes should be able to compete in athletic programs that best align with their gender identity.
Wow, in 2007. That's crazy.
Yeah. And actually, it's notable that even the physical form that students do have to submit to be able to participate in sports, it doesn't have a gender box or a birth sex box or anything like that. So it's just not part of the equation here in Washington. The U.S. Department of Education has launched a Title IX investigation into the Tumwater School District after a transgender girl from Shelton played in a high school girls' basketball game. And it's also opened up an investigation more recently into the lawsuit of a wrestler in Puyallup who alleges she was unknowingly made to compete against a transgender athlete and was sexually assaulted by them. And that lawsuit was just filed just a couple weeks ago. And the department is also conducting a separate, broader investigation of the Washington State Superintendent's Office over its gender-inclusive schools policy. In a letter to the Washington Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, the department said the investigation centers complaints from multiple Eastern Washington school districts that take issue with being required to adopt policies that allow transgender students to compete in girls' sports and use girls' locker rooms. The head of public schools in the state, Chris Rigdal, has been a very vocal supporter of allowing transgender athletes to compete in sports that align with their gender identity. Needless to say, Washington has become the target of some of the heat that we're seeing from President Trump's administration, which has promised to basically force blue states without bans on transgender athletes competing in girls' sports to do so. So that's all background there.
Yeah. When you line it all up like that, I hadn't even followed or realized that there was so much attention from the federal government on our policies. But it makes sense. And I wonder if the Supreme Court decision will embolden the executive branch as it puts pressure on states to end policies that, allow trans girls to compete in girls' sports. Last year, we saw the president threaten to withhold money from Maine for similar policies to the ones here in Washington. But Washington voters are actually going to tell us how they feel about this issue this year. Let's Go Washington, the conservative PAC funded by Brian Haywood, has an initiative on the ballot that would ban trans girls from girls' K-12 sports. Like we said in the intro, Haywood would contend that this initiative is about, quote, protecting female athletes. Does the Supreme Court decision affect this initiative at all?
So I would say short answer, the decision does not impact the initiative, but it could have some bearing on if voters ultimately decide to pass it. There are some key differences to note between the initiative Washington voters will weigh in on and the laws in Idaho and West Virginia that the Supreme Court just upheld. And it comes down to basically how gender is determined. So in other states, they often require that biological sex or a student's ability to compete on a girls' sports team is determined by what's written on a birth certificate. But in Washington, you are allowed to change the sex on your birth certificate. So instead, Let's Go Washington is asking for people to undergo a sex verification by health professionals. And according to previous reporting that I've done, this could include a genital exam. That is the cheapest and quickest way to do this sort of confirmation. The initiative also says that kids could get a chromosome test or a blood test to measure their testosterone levels. Those who oppose the initiative, from a group called No Hate in Washington State, called Washington's initiative proposal the most extreme proposal of its kind in the country. That group is also planning legal action if the measure passes this fall. Let's Go Washington has taken issue with our reporting. They don't want to emphasize the genital exam option. They think it'll scare away voters, and they would rather emphasize the lab test options, which are more expensive. They are also very happy about this new Supreme Court decision. They said yesterday that it's a big win, and they're hoping it translates into a win for their initiative this November.
Do we know where voters stand on this issue? I mean, I know there's national polling. I think Pew Research found that 2/3 of adults in the United States favor laws that require trans athletes to compete on teams that match with their sex assigned at birth. So bans are quite popular nationwide. But what about Washington State, Sarah? Do we know how voters here feel about this?
Yeah, so Washington tends to be more liberal than the country as a whole. But Brian Haywood has said he thinks moderate and conservative voters will come together to support this initiative and that it'll pass. And I should note that if Washington voters do pass this initiative in the fall, it would make Washington an outlier among the 27 other states with trans athlete bans on the books already. Those states are mostly conservative right now. Virginia is in that list, but that's kind of a purple state. Washington would be the most liberal state with a trans ban if this initiative does make it.
It's, Sarah, I've talked to you about my efforts to try and get my hands on a few of the polls or surveys that progressives have done in Washington State on this initiative. And it is weird that I can't get anyone to share. Like the campaign did a survey last fall. The Northwest Progressive Institute just did a poll. None of them will share it with me. And the rumors in the political consultant verse, which I try not to listen to, but it's hard not to avoid here. Is that those polls may say that the initiative is more popular than the campaign or progressives would like to say. But who knows? I have not seen the polls, just to be clear.
And sometimes that would mean the campaign would want to release it to try to encourage donations and encourage, people to come out and support their side.
The rule usually is that if the poll is good for you, you're okay giving it out to journalists and the public. Or at least to your donors. But in some cases, I've heard that even donors can't get their hands on these polls. And that tells me that it could be something that is negative for the campaign. Of course, it's very early. And a lot of voters, don't know, I think, how they feel. There's a lot of space to shape voters' feelings about it. But say November comes, voters decide, yes, we want to pass this initiative. What do the court challenges look like? Because Washington has its own constitutional protections like the Equal Rights Amendment, which it passed over 50 years ago, that, could have something to say about this. It protects against gender-based discrimination in school sports. And we know where the Supreme Court of the United States stands, but we don't know where the Washington Supreme Court stands. What might a legal challenge look like to this law?
Yeah, so an attorney with the Washington chapter of the ACLU and another attorney at UCLA have both mentioned that Washington's initiative, in some of the particular ways that it differs from the Idaho and West Virginia cases, could open it up to specific legal challenges. So while neither lawyer could say in particular how exactly these challenges would look, I think it would be fair to say that folks can expect a lawsuit likely around that particular manner in which Washington's initiative is looking to confirm birth sex, as we mentioned, and also in the way that this initiative only applies to girls' sports teams, but not boys.
So basically, if you're subjecting girls to a test that's a lot different than what boys have to do, it could potentially violate Washington's Equal Rights Amendment in the state constitution?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, ultimately, I think this is going to come down to, yes, how voters feel about competition and what advantage in competition looks like. And there is scant evidence. There is, some data, but it's pretty limited on how athletes who have gone through male puberty perform versus athletes who have gone through female puberty. Some of that, then looks at what happens if an athlete that goes through male puberty takes hormone blockers and how much the estrogen or hormone blockers can counteract that advantage conferred by testosterone. So that's all on one hand. But, that's all evidence that's been looked at with adults and adult athletes and members of the military. When it comes to K through 12 kids, this is really uncharted territory. And I think there's going to be a lot of other questions that voters have to look at about, again, how small this population is, at least that we know of, and what participation in sports really means for kids and what they believe in terms of how they think inclusion should work in a K through 12 setting versus, it's not the Olympics. It's not NCAA athletics. We're talking about junior high and high school, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I am genuinely interested to see how this argument plays out this year and where Democrats in a very liberal state stand on it. Libby, on your show, I think yesterday, we're taping this on Wednesday, but when the decision originally came out, you called for listener comments and feedback, and I was reading through some of those, and I should say your show, Soundside. I know we're your show too, but your other show, Soundside.
My other show.
We're just the redheaded stepchild. But
the very valued once-a-week show.
The one, yes, exactly. And we got a lot of comments. We always do when we ask for comments from listeners. I think this one was interesting, and I hear this kind of comment a lot from a listener named Peter. I'm writing as a longtime Democrat who strongly supports transgender rights in employment, housing, education, military service, public accommodations, and ordinary civic life. But the question of transgender girls competing in girls' K-12 sports has become a distinct political and fairness issue, and Democrats should not treat every concern about it as anti-trans animus. I hear some version of that fairly often. I haven't done any polling, but it does seem to me like it could be a somewhat common sentiment among the Democratic Party. I don't know, though.
So interesting. Yeah, I mean, I just will say, as someone who has been reporting on this for a little bit now, I feel like this is a question that kind of gets at this like core belief of where people feel gender starts and begins. Like, is it socialized or is it biologically a part of a person? And I don't know. I feel like that is a bipartisan kind of topic. I think it doesn't really fall along political lines, which has just been really interesting to see.
And it's like a new horizon that most people are navigating that they don't really have necessarily firm answers on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess to wrap it up, I will say an interesting thing about the Supreme Court decision that we did see come out. I was surprised that Justice Kavanaugh was actually a lot more metered in his decision than expected. In it, he acknowledged that, in quotes, it is an unhappy occasion whenever a student who wants to play school sports cannot do so. That, to me, signaled that he was a little more on the fence about the subject than you might have thought. Kavanaugh actually was a longtime high school girls basketball coach, and I think this kind of experience really comes out here in his view. It is important to note that trans kids are a marginalized group, and we've seen examples of trans athletes getting jeered at when they're competing, or in the very rare cases when they win against cisgender athletes. And this seemed in part to be some sort of acknowledgement from Kavanaugh about just how fraught this topic can get. And at the end of his decision, he writes something very interesting. He says, no student athlete on either side of the issue, whether a biological female or transgender, deserves to be ostracized or vilified. And the dissenting opinion doesn't totally disagree with everything that the majority wrote.
Oh, so like the liberals on the court.
Yeah. And so that to me suggests that this decision is just one kind of, like I was saying, one that is really fraught and complicated. And I guess I was just really surprised to see those acknowledgments from Kavanaugh in his opinion.
I can understand, Kavanaugh approaching it that way because, again, he's a youth sports coach. But trans kids not being able to participate in sports arguably are being ostracized, by this decision. And so I think, thinking about what an advocate for the, trans inclusion would say to that is, well, you're paying some lip service to that issue, but that is what's going to be the ultimate outcome of this ruling.
I do. I don't want to, you've covered this issue so much more than me, Sarah, but I'm not so surprised. I mean, he just said an unhappy occasion whenever a student. I would argue it can be much worse than an unhappy occasion. It can affect much in your life.
Totally.
But yeah.
Sarah Mises-Tan is KUOW's state government reporter. Sarah, thank you so much for wading into this with us. I know we're going to be covering it a lot more as the year unfolds and people are looking at this issue on their ballots in November. Thank you.
Of course. Glad to be here. Thanks so much.
And that's it for Sound Politics. I am Scott Greenstone. Our editor is Kat Smith. Our producer is Hans Anderson.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. And we say it every week, but it really is true.
It only gets truer.
It only gets more salient. You know what? This show is only possible because of your support, because somebody like you has given in the past. If you appreciate the work that we do here, the local journalism, the conversations that we have on KUOW and the Sound Politics podcast, KUOW.org/politics is the way to give, or there's a link in the show notes. And thank you.
We'll see you next week.